Do you believe in gods? No, I didn't say, do you believe in God? Do you believe in gods? I mean, do you believe that Jupiter, Juno, Minerva, Vulcan, all those folks, that once upon a time they really existed? And they flew around the Mediterranean, scaring people and doing things for people, having love affairs and getting in epic poems? Yeah, I thought you weren't quite sure about that one. Well, once upon a time, the gods were everywhere, and everyone believed in the gods. And now they don't, mostly. To think a little bit about how that came about, I want to talk today about what a god was, how you'd know one when you found one, and what sorts of things went into making up a god. The first thing you need to remember is there were always many, way many gods. And everyone agreed that. It wasn't just that every town had its own gods, its own collection of gods on a series of temples on a hilltop. It wasn't just that there were gods who dwelled in springs on farms, and the farmer went out and made sure the god was happy so the water would continue flowing. No, everybody knew there were lots of gods for lots of functions. Nobody could list them all, nobody knew all their names, nobody particularly cared to do so. And everyone agreed. People agreed, including Moses, St. Augustine, and lots of other people in between whom we think of as monotheistic. They may have had an idea that their god was the number one god, was a better and stronger god than others. And gradually over time, they came to a theory according to which the other gods both were and weren't really gods. In Augustine's time, in the 4th century of the Common Era, the argument was that the beings who were thought of as gods really did exist, and really did have remarkable powers. It's just that they weren't gods, you understand. They were the fallen angels of the Bible, who all still had a little bit of their angelic mojo with them, so to speak, and were able to pass miracles from time to time, so as to impress poor, gullible people into worshiping them. The tenacity of this can be seen in that 200 years after Augustine's lifetime, 200 years after the only official religion of the Mediterranean world was Christianity, when people went to anthologize the 5 million words of Augustine's works down to 1,000 pages, one particular theme they kept coming back to was what Augustine had to say about Pharaoh's magicians. Remember Pharaoh's magicians? They're in the Bible and everything. Moses and Aaron get into this contest with them, and of course it's the Bible. They win. But the troubling fact was that they were magicians. They did have mojo, and that was what took some explaining from the point of view of somebody who was trying to be a devout monotheist. But I'll come back to that. Start with the fact that there were many gods. What sorts of things could you say about gods? Well, gods had places. They had places where they dwelled. Sometimes it was that spring out on the farm. Sometimes it was the great temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus, Jupiter the best, the greatest, high atop the Capitoline Hill in the center of Rome. Jupiter tended to like high ground. He threw lightning bolts around, and you could tell because sometimes the lightning bolts hit his own temples, and that was a sign there was serious magic going on up in that space. If you've ever seen or can imagine the Acropolis in Athens, remember that the whole top of that mesa that sits in the center of the city was reserved for religious precincts for the gods who lived up there. At certain times, in certain ways, human beings went up to do business with the gods, but mostly the people who lived down in the hollers around the Acropolis, they knew there were gods up there, and you were careful about going where the gods went. Sometimes you could bring a god someplace by building the god a temple, but the god had probably better like the idea that there was a temple there, and the god had better be satisfied with the sort of worship that you offered. Gods had times. There were times when they were around and times when they weren't. Sometimes they were the kind of times when you knew that they were active. If there were gods of childbearing, they tended to show up when women were pregnant. If there were gods of crops and fields, well, they tended to show up at those times of the year as well. Other gods, lots of gods, had festivals and celebrations throughout the year. Sometimes they made sense chronologically. So a springtime feast for sowing crops, okay, that makes sense. But just when you might have a celebration in honor of Jupiter, well, that might depend on what kind of a mood Jupiter was in. It might depend on what kind of a mood the people who wanted to worship Jupiter were in. Sometimes these things could be turned into grand political spectacles. In the year 17 BCE, the Emperor Augustus, looking to consolidate his rule and his authority over religion, As a time he was refreshing marriage laws and encouraging childbearing and reviving, as he thought, the old religion. Conducted what he called the games of the century, the ludi saeculares. These took place for 3 days in late May and early June of 17. Theoretically, they happened every century or so, spaced far enough apart that no living person could possibly have seen them the last time they took place. Well, Augustus' games of the century were turning what had been a celebration of underworld gods into a celebration of gods of life and light. So the culmination day was in honor of Apollo and Diana. And so Augustus made sure that that ceremony took place on the brightest nights and days of the year, when the moon was just becoming full at the beginning of June, at a time when the sun was nearing the solstice, and when there would have been bright nights and bright days on the hills of Rome, long days for celebration, long nights for sacrifice and worship. Gods had people. They had people of their own. Some part they had the people who knew about them, cared about them, and looked after them and worshipped them. Sometimes they had not quite clergy, but people who hung around their temples, worked in their temples, got their living by associating with the gods. The high gods had priests, but those priests in both Greek and Roman cities were not full-time dedicated clergy. They were distinguished citizens who acquired the rank of priest rather the way a modern might acquire a rank in the order of the Masons or pick up an honorary degree here and there. It was an honorific kind of title that brought with it some activity. But many times we suspect that sacrifices that were taking place, the priest probably needed an expert standing at his elbow to whisper to him what was supposed to come next and what the correct steps of the ritual were. Gods did stuff, and they had stuff done for them. Many of the gods had functions that were attributed to and assigned to them. So gods of childbearing or gods of warfare or gods of navigation were all responsible for looking after certain spheres of human activity. But human beings also had to do things for the gods, and by and large there was a kind of implicit bargain. If you do something for me, a god was supposed to be saying, then I'll do something back for you. Just what it was human beings could do for gods, of course, was a little bit sketchy. Throughout antiquity, the practice of animal sacrifice was common and widespread. It was messy and complicated and expensive, and it began to fade from fashion later in the times of the Roman Empire in the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th century. But as long as it went on, there were plenty of nights and plenty of days when the centers of Roman and Greek cities smelled like great barbecue pits, when large numbers of animals were being brought in, slaughtered one at a time in ritual way, and then some form of barbecue, there were a couple of variant styles, took place. Sometimes, in some parts of the Mediterranean world, it was the so-called Holocaust, burning up the entire animal in honor of the god. In other cases, certain bits were burned up in honor of the god, while the rest of the bits, turned out to be the good meaty bits, were shared around in a banquet for the people who had attended the sacrifice. And already at all periods in classical antiquity, there were always people who wondered just what it was about the gods. Did they get high on the smoke that was coming up from the barbecue? Is that how it worked? And was that enough to please the gods? Well, apparently it was. Gradually over time, sacrifice, as I said, became less fashionable. It became possible to sacrifice little special cakes and pastries, maybe like our cupcakes, for example, or even just a grain of incense. By the time in the later Roman Empire, when there were anti-Christians who wanted to make sure the Christians showed respect for tradition, the anti-Christians would be satisfied if the Christian just burned a grain of incense on an altar to a god. Just some form of showing respect, some form of paying attention, gradually came to be enough of a sign that you too were a true and devout worshiper of the gods. One other thing about what people did was not everybody had to do it. As long as the sacrifices in honor of Jupiter, for example, in the city of Rome were conducted in an appropriate way by the city magistrates, that was good enough. If the games that went on with it, the chariot races and the pantomimes and the whoop-de-doo, were exciting enough and expensively enough produced by the magistrates of the year, then lots of crowds would come out. But if there were stingy magistrates and bad weather, not such crowds. But as long as the worship got done, plenty of citizens of Rome knew that they'd be okay with Jupiter because somebody else was taking care of business. They didn't actually have to show up for it themselves. Gods also had images. They looked like something. People knew what they looked like. Of course, if you were a big, powerful, famous god, people had seen lots of images and lots of statues of you, and they recognized the main attributes. Jupiter holding his thunderbolt, for example, or Juno wearing a particular headdress. If you were a lesser god, people might not recognize you so readily. Think of kind of lesser celebrities who creep back and forth across the covers of tabloid magazines from time to time. If it's Brangelina, you know exactly who you're looking at, but you must have had days in the supermarket when you weren't quite sure. Well, that's how people could be about lesser gods. They'd also say that some of those lesser gods, or lesser Hollywood celebrities, begin to look like each other. And they did. Some of the attributes would kind of migrate around from one to another. And modern archaeologists will get confused when they look at some of these images because they're not quite sure who they're looking for. My favorite example comes from way past the late Roman Empire, but it's a practice that had been in place for a long time. In 7th century AD Gaul, a perfectly Christian country, somebody discovered years ago a small piece of stone with a carving on it that was evidently meant to represent Christ. The insignia was clearly that of Christ, the key row that had been on emperors' shields for centuries. But this is Christ the warrior. It's Christ the warrior you can tell because he has a helmet, he has a shield, he has a spear, and he has a large erect phallus, just like you'd expect a warrior god to have. Well, for a long time after this was discovered, people said, oh, this isn't good, this isn't right, this is semi-pagan somehow. But the good scholarship now recognizes that all that was really going on there was people were trying to say about the God Christ the most flattering and impressive thing they could, to make clear that he really was a mighty and powerful warrior. And if some of the bits that got into that image didn't get into the images in your Sunday school a few years ago, well, stuff happens over time. These images get rationalized and streamlined. To stay with Christianity, Christ on the cross, for example, hundreds of years passed before anybody tried to depict the actual body of the living Jesus hanging on the cross. Much more common was Jesus in triumph standing in front of a cross after a resurrection. Images changed. They were mostly consistent, but sometimes not. Gods had stories. The big gods, they had big stories. You must know the one about Zeus and the swan. If you don't, you probably want to look it up. It's a little bit racy. There are plenty of stories about the gods in the Iliad and the Odyssey. Everybody had read the Iliad and the Odyssey. Almost everybody had read the Aeneid, except people who were too proud of their Greek to bother reading Latin literature. And there are stories about Jupiter and Juno and Venus and her husband Vulcan and, whoops, her lover Mars and people, gods like that. People like that, I wanted to say. Those stories could be familiar. Then there were minor gods who might have one or two little stories about them. And then we're back to the celebrities. How many celebrity divorce stories can you remember and how much can you tell them apart? Well, minor gods would tend to have the stories blurring together as well. Perhaps known a little better by the people who were really devoted to them, perhaps vaguely known or not recognized at all by people who did not know them. And last of all, the gods had names. Now there are exceptions to everything I've been telling you. There were, for example, so-called aniconic gods, gods who had no image. And there were gods who had no name. In the Bible, you may remember that St. Paul gets to Athens and finds an altar there in the Forum dedicated to the unknown God. He claims that one for his side. You can think about that if you want to. But mostly gods had names. You knew who you were talking to. Getting the name right, in fact, was important. We see until very late people concerned with getting the name right, because if you don't get the name right, you might call on the wrong god and get the wrong message. It's a little bit like some of the comedies of Grimm's fairy tales, where if you say the wrong magic formula, you get the wrong kind of result. And you didn't want that kind of stuff to happen. I said before there were lots of gods, lots and lots and lots of gods. And what people did with them was their own business. It was discretionary. When we talk about religion in antiquity, I get worried because people carry into the thought of antiquity ideas about religion from our own time. If I think about things that were like religion nowadays, like ancient religion nowadays, I think of categories like hobbies and entertainment and exercise. Think about hobbies. Some people crochet, some people collect stamps, some people do bungee jumping. If I was the anthropologist from Mars, I'd have trouble guessing what stamp collecting, crocheting, and bungee jumping have in common. But as soon as I say hobbies, you know what I mean. And you don't particularly care what other people's hobbies are. If you're a devout stamp collector, you may go around telling other people what great fun it is to collect stamps. But number one, you don't really expect them all to become stamp collectors. And number two, you're just as happy they didn't, because if they did, the price of the rare stamps you're trying to get would shoot up and you wouldn't be able to get very many, and it would be annoying for you, and maybe you'd quit collecting stamps and go try bungee jumping instead. Ancient religion was a little bit like that. You had your gods, you had gods who worked for you, you had gods in your city and other people took care of them and you were careful not to mess with them. If a really powerful god came along, you probably paid a little bit of attention, because getting wrong with a powerful god was a bad idea. When Christian emperors began shutting down temples, as a matter of fact, lots of people showed up in Christian churches on Sunday, not because they'd had a devout religious experience, not because somebody told them to, but because they realized this Christian god must be a pretty powerful god if he was getting the emperor on his side. And it probably wouldn't hurt if you showed up in his place from time to time, just to be careful. We know from places in Asia Minor that Judaism, which was traditionally a relatively exclusive religion, nevertheless had its hangers-on and wannabes. We have inscriptions from the Jews and God-fearers of Aphrodisias. And we're pretty sure the God-fearers were people who kind of liked hanging out with the Jews because the Jewish God did okay for them. Doesn't mean they didn't hang out with some other gods at other times as well, but when they were with the Jews, they were God-fearers and they were making sure this God knew they feared him, whoever else they might come to fear. Well, there were exceptions, and there's one big exception that some of you may have been thinking about. There was one God who didn't really get a name. The Jewish God in Jewish antiquity, in Hebrew, has his names, but there was strict restriction on when you could say them and how you could write them down. So it turned out that when the Jewish scriptures were translated into Greek first and then into Latin, they didn't carry over the real names of the Jewish God. Instead, everywhere they found the words that were used in Hebrew to name God, they replaced them with the Greek words for the Greek translation, theos and kurios. Theos is a generic word for God. Kurios is a generic word for Lord, Lord and Master, slave owner, something like that. When they did the Latin translations, they followed the Greek, and so they came out as Deus and Dominus. This was an accident of the practices of Jewish scribal transcription and Jewish religious worship and ritual. But what it meant was that by the time the Jewish God, who became the Christian God over time for Christians, was in Greek and Latin, the common languages of the Mediterranean world, he didn't have a special name. He was just God. He was just Lord. Reminds me a little bit of the old joke of the Jewish comedian who admired the Catholic kids in his neighborhood because they had the only the church on the block. The Christians turned out to have the only the God, the Lord, on the block in classical and later late antiquity. This turned out to be an immense advantage. It turned out to be one way of advancing the cause of what would become monotheism. Our God is not only special because he is mightier and taller and prouder and braver and angrier and kinder than your God. Our God is special because he's the God. And gradually over time, that naming practice could contribute to the idea that he was the one and only God, and that the other gods that thou shalt not have before him weren't really, as we saw before, gods at all. That namelessness was one important thing that set that Christian God apart. And it was something that took you a good step down the path to monotheism. Over time, a lot of forces contributed to putting away the ancient gods. The Emperor Constantine in the 4th century decided that he would become a follower of the Christian God for very traditional reasons, because the Christian God favored him in battle. We're in the year 312, we're in the year 2012, but it's just 1700 years since the year 312, when at a great battle at the Milvian Bridge just north of Rome, the Emperor Constantine, fighting it out with another claimant to the throne, claimed to have seen a vision in the sky. There's a couple of different versions of this, but the sort of high concept version has him seeing a fiery cross in the sky, and either hearing or seeing the words, "In this sign you shall conquer." Seeing that vision, he told his soldiers to mark crosses on their shields, and the next day they went out and won the battle, and so Constantine decided to be a follower of that God Christ. Never mind what might have happened if they'd lost that day. The future history of Christianity might have been very different. But they won, and so Constantine became a devoted follower of Christ in 312. But as I say, for very traditional reasons, because this god helped him win a battle. It could have been any other god. It could have been any of the other strong gods of antiquity that an emperor in that moment would call upon to be his favoring god and protector. And if he won, if he prevailed, any reasonable emperor would show reverence to that god for the rest of his life, as Constantine did. Constantine favored that god. He made sure people sacrificed to him. He built big buildings for him. The first version of the Vatican Basilica, outside of Rome, where now St. Peter's stand, was dedicated to St. Peter in the 300s by the Emperor Constantine. He was a very devout Christian. Of course, he did not quite get around to being baptized until he was on his deathbed 25 years later in 337. There were plenty of traditionalists and philosophers who always claimed the Christians in this period were the immoral ones because they could put off baptism until their deathbed and then do whatever they wanted to with their whole lives, only washing away their sins at the last possible moment. Surely, they argued, that was not true religion. Well, whatever it was, it doesn't exactly match all the forms of Christianity that we know about since. Gradually over time, in the decades that followed, other emperors succeeded who were themselves Christian, who followed the Christian God, who surrounded themselves with Christian clergymen who told them how shocking and scandalous it was that there were still traditional rites going on. In the year 391, the Emperor Theodosius, born in Spain, grown up entirely inside Christianity, took the step of banning formal public sacrifice and public expression of religion, took away the last of public funding from all the forms of traditional religion. That's the most conventional date to which we point for saying that the old gods began to go away. Oh, they lingered in lots of places. There were various groups of soldiers and police and sometimes people we would have to call terrorists who went around busting up temples in the years that followed. But for the most part, people recognized that this Christian God was a powerful God, and however they got there, they found themselves in Christian churches. Some of their old practices stayed on for a long time, and you can get in loud, long arguments about just which of the practices that surround the lives and the veneration of the saints of the Christian church really represent continuation of old religious practices in other forms. But pretty soon, you came to a point where nobody was worshiping the ancient and traditional gods. Oh, but now there's one problem with everything I've been saying to you. Do you remember what I asked you at the outset? Do you believe in the gods? And we mostly didn't. But have you been listening to the way I've been talking about them? I've been making them the subjects of sentences. Gods have images. Gods do things. Gods have places. Gods live in time. To me, one of the biggest puzzles, and it's one that I haven't solved to my own satisfaction, about the way we think about the ancient world, is the way we fall into that easy practice of treating those gods as though they did exist, talking about them as real beings, and giving them ideas and attributes. What should we be saying? Well, I'll mostly leave you to think about that. But what would it take to talk about human beings who believed there were beings who didn't exist, who made up stories, who made up images, who had things they did, and sometimes it all consolidated into a single set of practices, and a lot of times it didn't. If we didn't know about religion, if all the gods had gone out of the world in the late 4th and early 5th century and there weren't any left, I wonder what we would make of ancient religion then. That's a question that I really don't have the answer to.